Perhaps the most iconic remnant of Paleolithic European culture is the exquisite rock art depicting majestic animals on numerous cave walls. Here, I will cover one of the distinct cultures that made such art, the Magdalenians, who represent the last great flourishing of the Paleolithic in Europe. The 2 points I aim to get across are that hunter-gatherer societies were dynamic and did not exist in some static dream time, and that ways of life that lasted millennia could come to an abrupt end as a result of a changing climate. The Magdalenians were a late Paleolithic Western European culture that flourished between roughly 19,000 and 11,000 years ago. They specialized in reindeer and other large animal hunting, leaving numerous beautiful cave paintings as their most well-known legacy. At their height, they were spread across modern France, Spain, Germany, and into Central Europe, the Low Countries, and southern England. Perhaps the most distinct aspect about the Magdalenians is their origins, which will require a brief and vastly oversimplified summary of the admittedly still enigmatic European Paleolithic. Most notably, they had significant ancestry from the Aurignacians, the first permanent human population in Europe, who displaced the Neanderthals in previous colonization attempts by anatomically modern humans. Several thousand years after the Aurignacians colonized most of Europe and the Neanderthals had gone extinct, a new wave of Homo sapien settlers arrived, known as the Gravettians, largely replacing Aurignacian people in Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe, but leaving them with their last redoubts in the far west of modern France and Spain, where interactions between the groups created a new population. Millennia passed, the ice sheets extended and receded, and the continent of Europe was repopulated by descendants of these populations who had held out in refugia in the south, while other lineages simply died out. In the Balkans and Italy, this is represented by the so-called Epigravettian culture, which corresponds to the Villabruna genetic cluster, which was possibly Gravettian plus some Near Eastern and North Eurasian admixture. And in Iberia and southern France, with the Magdalenian culture heavily associated with the Goyet Q2 genetic cluster, significant Aurignacian-related ancestry with some Epigravettian type admixture. Archaeologist Jennifer French confirmed this, with the assessment that the 3 main refuges for human populations at the end of the Paleolithic were, from west to east, Franco-Iberia, the Balkans, and the plains of Ukraine and European Russia, though the last is not really relevant here. It is generally considered that the Magdalenian culture emerged around 19,000 years ago as the Last Glacial Maximum came to an end. But it did not form ex nihilo, and almost certainly evolved from the previous Solutrean culture, as Iberia served as a relatively stable refuge for this distinct ancestry until the Mesolithic. The Magdalenians were, to a large extent, specialized in hunting reindeer and other megafauna across the tundras of Ice Age Western Europe. This made them quite different from the mostly fisher-foragers who came after them, and demonstrates the diversity of ways of life often encapsulated with the blanket term hunter-gatherer. Diet was one of the main ways these Paleolithic people differed from the Mesolithic populations who came after them, as the latter seem to have eaten significant amounts of fish and marine invertebrates, while the former relied more on terrestrial prey animals. The Magdalenians manufactured harpoons and atlatl spear throwers, which further demonstrates their resourcefulness and skill in hunting. Unlike hunter-gatherer communities who lived in Russia and Ukraine, and who built impressive structures of mammoth bones, the Magdalenians seem to have lived in tents, and it has been argued that some of these functioned as aggregation sites, where communities of a wider area periodically assembled for mutual cooperation. The Magdalenian core areas, and the areas where they left the most significant legacy, were centered in modern France and Spain, but they extended much further north and east as well, into practically all of southwestern, western, and central Europe, as far east as Poland. This indicates the success their way of life enjoyed at higher latitudes in Europe, for a time at least. In Britain, for instance, there was a Magdalenian presence, but it proved transient. Here, some adventurous Magdalenians likely sojourned into these frozen lands at the far northern edge of the known world in pursuit of migrating reindeer, which seems to have been present by at least 15,000 BCE. Their presence and ultimate legacy in Britain, however, was limited, and this will be explored in more detail later on. Perhaps the most famous relic of the Magdalenians is their cave art, which typically depicts large animals, and unlike later Mesolithic art, such as this one from Cogul, Spain, practically never depicted human figures. Magdalenian art almost certainly was a communal activity that involved participation from the entire broader society, and probably was meant to get everyone involved in the culture of hunting. One study on the Atxurra Cave in Spain explored the intricacies of Magdalenian art, and although it focused on this specific site, of course, there might be lessons applicable to Magdalenian culture as a whole. They stated, Paleolithic art functioned as a system of visual communication with a specific message shared by the human group involved in the action, or even by other different groups. Further speculation based on charcoal analysis demonstrates that while torches were used to illuminate the walls during the original creation of the works, open fires allowed for viewing by members of the community. Although we cannot be sure as to the details, Magdalenian art was almost certainly not purely decorative or stylistic, but was meant to impart important lessons on how to survive, likely by knowing the megafauna's behavioral patterns, such as mating and breeding seasons and migration patterns. On a darker side, the Magdalenians had very distinct funerary customs, most distinguished by the consumption of human flesh. Additionally, there have been found what seem to be drinking cups made from human skulls. Although such practices may seem barbaric, it may demonstrate the very deep connection these people had with their dead, in which flesh was literally eaten and parts of the body kept around as memento moris. The close connection of these cannibalistic funerary rituals to Magdalenian culture is also well supported by genetic evidence, in which it has been demonstrated that there was a direct correlation between Magdalenian Goyet Q2 type ancestry and funerary cannibalism, as well as a corresponding connection between the more conventional burials and Epigravettian Villabruna ancestry. This seems to demonstrate that cannibalism was so deeply ingrained in Magdalenian culture. Indeed, one in-depth study came to a conclusion that the frequency of cannibalistic cases among Magdalenian sites exceeds any incidence of this behavior among earlier or later hominin groups. In technical terms, although archaeologists are notorious for describing something as ritual over literally every other explanation, it is likely that there was some sort of complex ritual behind this behavior that we cannot fully understand today. Perhaps an effort to keep some essence of the dead alive, literally, in future generations. For such a rich and flourishing culture, with such a wide geographic range, stretching practically from Gibraltar to the Baltic, the Magdalenians came to a relatively abrupt end as their cultural traditions and artwork died out, and they left shockingly little ancestry in any post-Mesolithic European population. As the temperatures warmed roughly in the period of 13,000 to 10,000 years ago, this resulted in significant changes in ecologies as forests became more widespread over the Western European landscape. The result was drastic changes in the animals available to hunt, and food sources in general. The Magdalenian hunter-gatherer populations responded in broadly two ways: by retreating north to follow the animals they had traditionally hunted, or by staying behind in the recently forested areas and adapting to them. This is somewhat backed up by genetic evidence, as it appears that the Magdalenians of northern Europe mostly died off and were replaced by people with Villabruna Epigravettian ancestry, only providing a bit of admixture from likely a single admixture event, with maximum Goyet Q2 ancestry being around just 25%, whereas in southern Europe, the expanding Epigravettian people gained quite a bit of this Magdalenian ancestry, averaging between 25 and 75% from multiple admixture events. An example of this, mostly dead end in northern Europe, is how at Atxurra Cave in England, almost 13,000 years ago, the ancestry of a sampled inhabitant was totally Goyet Q2, while from Kendrick's Cave, the human remains from nearly 10,000 years ago were of the Villabruna type ancestry, associated with the Epigravettian. Based on the available genetic and archaeological evidence, my tentative hypothesis for the final doom of the Magdalenians is this: those late Magdalenians who ventured north to follow their traditional food sources were unable to adapt, and so were eventually subsumed by expanding Epigravettian people whose toolkits better allowed them to exploit these new forested ecologies. In comparison, those who stayed behind in southwestern Europe and adapted to the changing conditions were able to merge with the Epigravettians on a much more equal basis. Perhaps the key takeaway is that running from one's problems to greener pastures is never really a long-term solution. The long tradition of distinct Paleolithic art depicting majestic animals and hunting scenes also came to an end, and Mesolithic art was much more likely to depict human forms. This is speculation, but I think that while the shift was in part fueled by demographic change, with the proliferation of Villa-Bruna-type ancestry into Northern and Western Europe, it was more so a result of a cultural change caused by the significant ecological shift. While hunting reindeer and other megafauna across the tundras of Europe would likely have required massive amounts of group effort for the entire community, and have been a significant event once completed, one worthy of celebration and immortalization through art. After Europe became largely forested, and people instead hunted smaller game and fished, it probably would not have resulted in the same celebration for a successful hunt, as people likely hunted more regularly but in smaller groups, going after less physically formidable prey. For better or worse, the millennia-old tradition of human flesh consumption also came to an end, but it is not clear if this was a result of internal changes in culture or from being replaced and absorbed by the expanding Epigravettian-related people. Although there is probably no language around today descended from one spoken by a Magdalenian tribe, and no one alive today has anywhere near a majority or even a plurality of Goyet Q2 ancestry associated with the Magdalenians, their legacy did not come to a total end. Unlike in the rest of Europe, the eventual post-Magdalenian cultures of Mesolithic Iberia and Gaul harbored significant amounts of this ancestry. For instance, the Azilian culture, centered in southern France, was one of these successor cultures, which boasted a combination of Goyet Q2 and Villa-Bruna type ancestries. Their art style was very distinctive, a far cry from the previous cave paintings. It was mostly centered on elaborately decorated pebbles. There have been many different interpretations, including the idea that the dots of these pebbles may represent lunar cycles, but of course, we do not know for sure and probably never will. Finally, after 4400 BCE, with the continent-wide European hunter-gatherer resurgence, Magdalenian ancestry introgressed into the arriving Anatolian farmers, and has continued in small amounts up to present. Although rare, the dominant Magdalenian Y haplogroup, a distinct subclade of C, has survived to this day in parts of northern Spain. Of course, I would not want to distill a culture as long-lasting and as artistically productive as the Magdalenians down to a simple didactic lesson which we in the 21st century can take. But I do think that it is important to remember how climate change can end ways of life, even ones established for millennia.